So in a just started project this January, myself, Kuntala, and Radhika Krishnan of Triple IT Hyderabad, we're trying to get grounded in the sense that we're trying to sort of see from the ground up what would energy justice and a just transition look like from the point of view of coalfield communities. So I'll try to draw on Kuntala's discussion, carry on from that one in a sort of more applied format. Whether this will ultimately lead on to what we had actually promised the funder in terms of a planning framework, or if we'll stick to something more broad-based principles that may help in the transition. Let's see. But this is also the first time I'm trying to present this very much work in progress around the broader principles of just transition. But let's see what we will make of this. We do have, like Kuntala said, like her vast experience in coal, but I'm also finding myself strangely placed with the possibility of returning to coal fields where I was doing some work 10 years ago, and we'll also try to do that, and not only mainly in Jharkhand in this project, but we're also trying to locate ourselves in Telangana coal, where I did some studies some 10 years ago, and one can actually get a bit of result of whether what one predicted back then was actually anything that turned out to be the case. And we'll try to see some of these trajectories of the past, mainly of expansion, dispossession, and environmental degradation, but also see how it may build on to livelihoods and community development and voice in these highly uneven processes, but with a positive potential outcome given the new impetus for a transition away from coal and the possibilities that solar energy and other renewable energies seem to bring. But these are the vast coal areas, and many of the field photos I have here are from sort of more recent field work in Korba, where the biggest coal mines in the state of Chhattisgarh, the biggest coal areas of India, some enormous expansions to illustrate this goal of 1 billion tons per year. This has been the reality that we've been working on. Largely indigenous lands, informal pockets of agriculture or forest product collection, limited compensation across Central Eastern India. Any new mine will be these vast open cut mines using large land areas, and the sort of thermal power plants and waste areas that you're seeing in addition to the coal mines that require even more land. In the background here is also a lot of the storage overburden areas as well, and you get a sense of the scale, perhaps, of this 10-kilometer wide mine from the little trucks that are actually really big trucks. We see activities on thinking through justice, and we have impressive movements that have worked on different social issues in these areas. But for a long time, we have powerful land rights in the background, forest access laws. There is a whole regulatory framework around environmental science. Ultimately, it's the cheapness of solar power that seems to be making real impact in probably, you can't really talk of a retraction or mass closure, but at least a slowing down of the rates of coal expansion. And perhaps the most visible sign that change is underway is how the coal mining companies and the thermal power companies themselves are setting up solar power plants these days. But here, it's not only, of course, the coal fields that are affected, and a coal closure and a just transition affects national energy security, a whole range of complicated issues of energy transformations, and the supply of energy to different groups of people, It has to do with infrastructure, the railway, the ports, but also local infrastructure in terms of schools and health systems. Where we're not so close concerned with those things here, but trying to look at coalfield livelihoods. What we're trying to see is what happens then when the coal mines close. And even though we've talked of the mass closures as a future, we do know to an extent, and we will study more closely, what happens when coal mines do close at present. They close typically when the coal is exhausted. They close when mines are waterlogged, or underground mines that are too expensive to run. Sometimes, of course, these effects combine. What we see are abandoned mine pits and waste piles, local infrastructure falling into disrepair. We see some amount of retraining and reassignment if you're a formal worker. If you're informal, you're largely left to your own devices, either like in the background here in an informal coal mining pit. You might be able to go down into the old mine and extract a bit of coal to sell in the local market. Else, your main option would be a move to a nearby city, because that's how you can support yourself. These moon landscapes that are left are then typically not easy to see as the source of new livelihoods, but we will continue to argue that point that it's not impossible to foresee the reuse of the vast land areas left in the wake of coal. Two main groups, though, of concern here: the previously dispossessed, the mainly Adivasi groups that have been living in these areas, a range of different groups, but nevertheless sort of coherently possible to identify as Adivasis, the original dwellers of the area. Rain-fed farming, forest-based livelihoods, typically informal land holdings, usually not able to access formal education and only semi-integrated into regular society. But this group, once displaced, have typically stayed on in the area to become part of the coal economy, and the closure of coal puts a double pressure on them. They've been previously unfairly dispossessed and now might also lose a livelihood without being able to return or gain hold of that land. But the coalfield is not only a place that people are dispossessed from or pushed away from, it's also a melting pot of other groups. And that turns our interest to the second group of informal workers, the coal truckers, coal scavengers of different kinds. Brick mills come up on the sidelines of the coal industry because you can access coal legally or illegally. You can access it from the coal mines, from loading points. Vast numbers of people work in other service industries around the restaurants and hotels and other functions that come up next to the coal communities. We note near and quite far away migrant workers being attracted to the coal fields, and by now established coal fields of many decades, or perhaps even a century or so in some parts of especially West Bengal. These are far from new areas, and yet we have these still semi-migrant, semi-residential groups that don't have the same historical ties as the Adivasis, but yet firm base and a real stake in the area and a right to livelihoods, and yet not formally recognized or formally employed by the mining companies. So in our new project by the Swedish Research Council for Rural Development and Environment, FORMAS, we're proposing to plan for a just energy transition from the ground up. Our main piece of work here will be in North Karampura. That's where we worked previously, and this map is from one publication of mine where Kuntala and Patrik Wenvedström did a combined GIS and political economy analysis of the growth of the coal field. And it's this sort of growth that we will also try to understand the entire coal field separated into blocks and individual mines that have grown organically over the years, and try to see what would that retraction and reversal of these processes potentially mean across these many mines, but in a quite small Adivasi region of the state of Jharkhand. We're considering then 4 principles to guide our sort of planning or thinking through justice in the coal fields. And like all good frameworks, it relies on 4 R letters. Let's see, they might be very much up for grabs. But restitution in this sense, are historical injustices in the post-colonial setting of India, but we may consider a range of other locations, hopefully, and it'd be really interesting to see how sub-Saharan African or Latin American experiences may or may not fit into colonial settler regimes that never recognized the original dwellers, then supported by independent states in the non-recognition of earlier land uses and rights, and what that might mean as coal starts to retract, inevitably, whether by market or by a just transformation political perspective. So our first principle is really asking, to what extent can injustices be undone in the retreat of coal? From the slide of households into the big Gevra mine, again in Korba, Chhattisgarh. I'll just go quickly through these, but you'll see, happy to take questions on these later on. Returning to the informal workers, the redeployment is a principle of what do we do with the vast number of informal workers that neither we nor authorities nor coal companies probably even know who they are. We certainly don't know their skills, their possibilities for entering into new suitable livelihoods. We know that they exist in large numbers, although the actual numbers might be somewhere in the 10 millions up to 25 millions, according to different estimates. They're vastly outnumbering the formal workers. Here in the background, as coal scavengers, typically part of the Jharkhand coal cycles, here hitching a ride on a motorcycle along the World Bank-sponsored highway. But what they tend to do is load these bicycles with an impressive amount of some 100+ kilos of coal and push that bike into nearby towns or villages, or simply sell it by the roadside as a way of making a living. You access the coal somewhere informally, and entire households then collaborate to make a living off of selling the coal. And this entire separate supply chain is a vast supply chain of coal on its own, and a livelihood for typically displaced villagers who may have their village house, but no longer any land or any meaningful land that can be cultivated because the coal is nearby. So what are they supposed to do now? Are they supposed to do agriculture, forest livelihoods, or simply migrate? These are very big questions within this large group of informal workers. Restoration of the moon landscape, the degraded coal fields, is not going to be easy, and we've yet to come across a successful example in India, but the international experience points to surprisingly short time periods where one can recreate not the full biodiversity and agricultural intensity of what was there before, but nevertheless make the area amenable to a range of different livelihoods. And this sort of land distribution is the word I'm looking for, could be a real opportunity for both the restitution processes and the redeployment processes. I've also argued in a recent article with Vasudha. It's often been very impressive to my mind what can be done on the outskirts of industrial sites. As soon as there's a bit of water and a bit of land, in the background here, also in Korba, is a massive aluminium coal, an alumina smelter actually, waste pile. But nevertheless, the principle is often there that one sees enormous possibilities to cultivate even the smallest spots. I don't know if it's environmentally safe, and public health expertise would really help to ensure the safe surroundings of this, because these are highly polluted areas in many cases. And the money and resources to turn hundreds of meters of deep pits and the waste hills into productive areas will be enormous. But nevertheless, there is forest rights in India that shows the way to democratic resource control. And clearly enormous challenges in this transition, but here also a real opportunity. I don't know how I'm doing on time, but I'm almost done now. Yeah, should be good. Finally, redemocratization. Bollywood has made a number of films on the illegalities of coal areas. The gangs of Wasipur also had a follow-up movie tracing the coal mafia, basically militant gangs, local thugs with guns, but very close connections to the administration, to politicians, also to militant left-wing insurgency groups, and especially in Jharkhand, we note guns and money guiding the way that coal is extracted, sold, and distributed, rather than the democracy that is in place with such impressive structures across the country since long. Nevertheless, our comparative perspective here and the Telangana case shows that this rule of guns need not be the case. And we're hoping that the local resource control and local land use in these processes at least open for some possibilities to redemocratize the area, as well as part of the moving away from coal. Yes, so these are the 4 principles that we're thinking of. I wasn't quite sure if I should show this sort of more complicated way of thinking about this, and this is, of course, just a draft, but it might make things a little bit clearer of what sort of processes we're thinking about. I hope you can see my pointer as well, the sort of more cultural history and belonging perspectives of restitution, of repairing the historical injustices, but the very material and direct possibilities of land rights and the law that says that only Adivasis have the right to own agricultural land in this area, really straddles the next box of redeployment, of finding new ways of living, hopefully for a lot of people within these areas, because this is their homes and it does have a whole lot of opportunities and possibilities. But if not, also vast skill development programs, infrastructure needed for new ways of life. And it's not, of course, that agriculture or forest-based livelihoods offer very great opportunities. Even regular farmers move away from agriculture, and there's been massive protests around agricultural changes in policy proposed in the recent year. But nevertheless, here, if the alternative is mass migration, it'll hopefully be possible for some. In this framework, there's clear then connections to the land restoration, landscape restoration on a vast scale, with the need for proper mine closure and pollution control. And I don't know how to illustrate that in this framework yet, but we sense another possibility in the CSR funds that are mandatory to spend, and I should perhaps also mention district mineral funds, where increasing funds are being put aside by companies, but not usefully mobilized and controlled by the communities themselves. But at least the fund crunch is a massive challenge here. Otherwise, that we see some possibilities for here. And somewhere here in the final point, redemocratization and its law and order challenges.